Hey ghosties, thank you for listening to my first ever podcast. I'm excited you are here and I look forward to creating many more episodes to come. My goal for this season 1, is to cover hauntings, ghost stories, and generally unsolved true crimes that have that kind of paranormal element to them. If you have any hauntings you want me to cover, let me know. All right, let's get on with the show. Hey ghosties, have you heard the tale of the witch's castle? No, neither had I. Our story begins in Utica, Indiana, a quaint river town with a long history tied to the Ohio River, sitting only a few minutes drive from Jeffersonville, Indiana, or Louisville, Kentucky. Legend tells that a coven of witches once lived in the now crumbling remains of a stone castle, but a deeper look into the history of the property tells us much, much more than that. We're going to jump back in time to the 12th century Britain, where the Celtic prince Madoc, also referred to as Madoc, or as I like to say, Mad Dog, so that may happen, refuses to fight his brothers for the throne after his father's death and sails across the Atlantic Ocean in search of the New World. Prince Madoc, along with 10 boats of Welsh women and men, would dock in what is now known as present-day Mobile, Alabama, centuries before Christopher Columbus would ever make his fated voyage. The story continues that the Welsh settlers would continually run out of settlement after settlement, moving further and further north to avoid hostile locals and eventually settle in what is now known as present-day Utica. According to historians, this area and what is now known as present-day Jeffersonville would also be part of a satellite settlement of Prince Madoc and his crew. What is known as the Witch's Castle is said to be one of the last standing remnants of the massive stone fort Madoc and his crew erected. It is said that the bloody final battle between Welsh settlers and American Indians would eventually eliminate the race, but later reports by Thomas Jefferson around 1804 said that he had heard of Welsh-speaking American Indian tribes and would later also tell of Welsh Native Americans living in Missouri. It is said that Thomas Jefferson believed the story of Madoc, and he instructed what would then become the Lewis and Clark expedition that we all know to find descendants of the Madoc Welsh Indians. A Jeffersonville native, Dana Olson, would publish a book titled The Legend of Prince Madoc and the White Indians, which allegedly tells the amazing story of the 12th century seafarer and his settlement in the New World. Many historians, archaeologists, and scientists say that the story of Madoc and Utica is merely a myth and that nothing concrete actually backs up any of the claims. So okay, that tells us how the castle came to be, but what about the witches? That's what we're here for, right? Local legend tells of a coven of witches who once lived in the now crumbling stone structure. It is said that the witches were not trusted by the locals, and the locals wanted them out of their town. In an attempt to rid them from the town, they attempted to burn down the castle. Aside from the legend, however, I'm unable to find any concrete details on these supposed witches. A prior owner had stated that there was vandalism to the property, which did cause a portion of the stone structure to catch fire. Perhaps that is where the lore originated. That brings us to a second legend surrounding the castle. A young boy and his parents lived on the property, but were attacked by a burglar. The boy would survive, but his parents would not. The burglar would be executed for several heinous crimes, stretching beyond the boy and his family. However, the young boy would never recover, and as an adult, he would come back, track down 7 close relatives of that burglar, kidnap them, and hold them in his home. He would later hang them from the trees that tower over the witch's castle before shooting himself. I tried to find any specific articles that suggested such a crime had taken place in the area, specifically something similar to that at the witch's castle, but again, I could not find one. This leads us to a third event tied to the witch's castle that is locals speculating who really haunts the ground. On the night of January 10th, 1992, 4 teenage girls, Melinda Lovelace, Lori Tackett, Hope Rippey, and Toni Lawrence, would show up at fellow classmates' home, Shanda Sharer, kidnap her, torture her, and eventually set her on fire, leaving her to burn alive. This event is often connected with the witch's castle as being where the murder happened, but it actually didn't. The 4 girls who kidnapped Sharer would initially take her to witch's castle, remove her jewelry, and threaten to cut off all of her hair. Just kind of standard 12-year-old bully stuff. But then they would then proceed to light a fire and leave shortly after because they believed they had been drawing too much attention to themselves. They would pack up Sharer and drive to a set of woods behind Lori Tackett's home and proceed with torturing and stabbing young Sharer until strangling her with a rope, but only until she lost consciousness. Still alive, but unconscious, the 4 girls would place Sharer in the trunk of a car and not return to her until the next morning. That following morning, they would proceed to drive around town randomly, further beating Sharer with a tire iron and spraying her with flammable liquids. The 4 girls would then drive to a location just off US Route 421 where they would wrap Sharer in a blanket, pour gasoline all over her body, and set her on fire before walking away. All girls would be tried as adults, and all took plea bargains to avoid the death penalty. As of this podcast, all 4 women have been released from prison. Now, the horrendous torture and murder of Shanda Sharer is often the kind of story that you would hear attached to a haunted location. But again, she wasn't murdered there, which is frequently misquoted in connection to the witch's castle. So, is the witch's castle really haunted? This leads us to a local named Jenny Stewart. Jenny claims to be a medium and paranormal investigator who grew up hearing the tales of the witches. Stewart has stated that when she visited the ruins as a high schooler, sometime in the 80s before she realized she was a medium, with a group of friends who were curious to see the much talked about spot, she experienced things. Young Jenny Stewart was said to have been turning around in the castle when she caught a glimpse of a woman dressed in old-fashioned attire. Stewart claims the woman extended her hand to Stewart, who then cried out to her friends, "Did you see it? Did you not see the lady?" They didn't. Stewart claims she then began to walk closer to the woman, but the closer she would get to her, the harder it was to see her, until she had completely vanished. Stewart and her friends would leave the site soon after, and in the months and years that would follow, she would continue to be teased about what she saw and vowed that she knew what she saw and that someday she would return and prove it. In 2008, Stewart founded the Paranormal Research and Resource Society and would return to the site after the current owners agreed to let her investigate the property. Stewart was broadcasting live on an internet radio show as she walked the property and was dictating to listeners what she was seeing. During the walk, she heard a sharp crying sound, ripped out her earpiece so she could try to get a better listen. At the same time, her now husband spotted a 6-foot-tall shadow person and started walking toward it. Stewart spotted the shadow person as well and began yelling at her partner not to touch it. As he advanced on the shadow, it dissipated. Stewart is quoted as saying, "It was like somebody turned a fan on," and then the crying stopped. Stewart would later discover what a fox sounded like and agreed that it sounded a lot like the crying she had heard. Stewart and her group would return several times, recording their experiences. They often tried using a ghost box to communicate with any spirits that might have been trapped at the property. On one occurrence, Stewart claims to have captured a conversation with a spirit that she could only hear after listening to the recording after the session. Her team and members of her crew would ask the following questions. Do you hear voices? Yes. Trying to get there, another replies. How? Punch through the vortex. Stewart said she believes the second recording is the shadow figure warning them to go away and not mess with it. After many trips to the witch's castle, also known as Mistletoe Falls, Stewart would canvass the town, knock on doors, and try to find anyone who could have any actual information on the area. She did find one man, who has now since passed on, who appeared to tell the story of the burglary and the murder that we mentioned earlier. However, Stewart could not find any evidence to corroborate that man's tale. And the Baird's History of Clark County, Indiana, which documents the early days, makes no mention of any type of murder on the property outside of describing several accounts of killings between Native Americans and settlers. Even though Stewart has found no evidence to support the claims of the boy and the burglary story, she believes that the 7 souls of his victims are trapped at Witch's Castle, and that the orphaned boy is the shadow person turned evil by his obsession for revenge. Stewart is quoted as saying she thinks the ruins are forever haunted, the site of a shocking mass murder and the former location of a legendary settlement. The most common claims people make regarding the haunting of the area are seeing a little girl laughing in the woods and hearing loud thumps, claims of white mist moving faster than regular mist in and out of the remains of the stone structure. There are 2 remaining windows within the structure. People claim to see someone peeking out the windows or hear conversations around the window that aren't really happening because no one is there. The small girl is about 7 or 8 years old, wears a white dress, and has long black hair that covers her face. Honestly, the description of the little girl sounds like the girl from the Ring movie franchise to me. Regardless of if the Witch's Castle or Mistletoe Falls, whatever name you want to call it, is truly haunted, is left to be known. However, I am glad I delved deeper into this mystery. The story behind Prince Madoc and the Welsh settlers of the land expanded my own view of American history, which I appreciate since we're now learning that we were taught a sanitized version of what actually happened in grade school. Otherwise, that's it. That's the story of Witch's Castle in Utica, Indiana. Had you ever heard of it? Do you know any information that I didn't touch on? Let me know. I'd love to actually hear some more concrete evidence that something paranormal but I'm definitely skeptical given what I found. It is important to note that paranormal experiences are often subjective, and there are usually perfectly reasonable explanations for what's actually going on, but sometimes there aren't. Until next time, I'm your host, Brandy, and you've been listening to Ghosted.